we are talking about internal controls. So we talked a little bit about inherent risks, and now we're going to talk about controls. Certainly for investment accounts, they're mainly wanting to overstate. So existence, occurrence, and valuation are a lot more problematic than completeness. With investments, the idea is investments in securities need to make sure that there are being tracked purchases and sales of securities in other organizations should be approved by the board. There should be records of this. People shouldn't be trading for their own accounts, I guess, in other words. And a way to kind of fake revenue out of this part of the cycle would be to say you have some investment revenue, right? Like some interest income, some dividend income. Right, because again, we're talking about accruals. So if it doesn't actually show up, right? So you could say, dividends receivable or something. And who's to say? Well, it's pretty easy to look up and see if a dividend was declared or see if a bond interest was actually paid. So it can be looked up, or loan, right? A loan receivable. Right, you can look that stuff up. Completeness, again, not as big a concern, this assertion. But certainly they could put things in different periods. Valuation, I would say, is a very big concern. So there should be controls for that. And the controls for valuation is there should be somebody in charge of it. There should be a process. Here's at the end of the period. Here's who does this. Here's what they do. Here's who decides on the valuation. Here's who does the accounting for the valuation. So that if something needs to change in its valuation, somebody's doing it. And again, still with investments, we need to make sure that things are being classified properly. In other words, the presentation and disclosure section. Remember, derivatives that are used for hedges are different than derivatives that are just straight up investments. So the accounting for those has to be correct. So they have to have a process to ensure how something is classified. Like the board should have to approve it. There should be like a process. So you as the auditor would check, do they have that in place? You don't decide their process, but they need to have one. Right? With long-term debt, right? So again, I would say the primary concern here is completion. They want to get stuff off the books, right? They want to understate long-term debts. So, of course, things need to be recorded properly. There should be segregation of duties, so you look for that. Amortization calculations, things like that. There should be a process in place. And again, presentation and disclosure. Long-term debt, as it becomes due within the next year, transfers over to become current debt, right? So classification of debt as either current or long-term, we need to be careful of, right? Because if you have notes that are payable and it's a mortgage and it's a 30-year mortgage, well, that whatever you got to pay within the next year is current, right? So they may be trying to mess with their working capital ratio, right? Say they have a debt covenant that they have to take care of. Well, if they have to maintain a certain working capital ratio, they want their current liabilities to look low, so they shove them out in long-term liabilities, stuff like that. So there has to be processes in place anywhere along the way. But completeness and probably presentation and disclosure are things to watch. Another thing with presentation and disclosure is they'll categorize capital leases as operation leases, right? Operating leases. So that would be a presentation disclosure issue right there. Capital stock. Typically capital stock is being arranged for through third-party people, so it's pretty easy to do your confirmations through their transfer agent. stuff like that, brokers. But it certainly is possible that something gets presented incorrectly. Options aren't allocated correctly. So you're looking for procedures in place that everything goes through a transfer agent and they do something, or everything has to be approved by this person. So you're looking for that. And the same thing with retained earnings. I suppose it's possible they don't record the dividends, or they don't update retained earnings after a restatement of a prior period, something like that. So there should be something in place to ensure that once dividends are declared, they're, taken out of retained earnings, things like that. So there should be something in place. All right. So the main controls are things like these big transactions should be authorized by the board, right? If they're going to invest mega millions of dollars, there should be some authorization for that. So you should be able to go to the board of directors minutes of their meeting and see where that was approved or where that was classified properly. So when they invest in securities of some kind, it should probably go through some kind of a broker. There should be documentation there, right? So documentation of board of directors meetings, documentation from brokers. PP&E, there should be some kind of invoice or cost records for that PP&E. Certainly bond transactions, you should have copies of the loan covenants, you should have copies of those contracts, stockholders' equity, documentation from the registrar. Trace transactions, right? These are all transactions that are financing and investing, so you're getting cash and investing cash, right? So you should be able to trace that cash, right? So how can you test controls, right? So testing controls, you're not testing this is not substantive testing. We're not testing, is that number on the financial statement the right number? We're testing are they doing the things they say they do, right? When a stock is sold, does it go to the broker, right? When PP&E is purchased, do we have a process for getting an invoice and paying for it, right? So because these are high dollar things that should be approved by the board of directors, there should be board minutes, the recordings of the meetings that you can look at. So read those minutes. That would be a test of internal controls. Inquiring about segregation of duties, right? Observing people doing segregation of duties. Inquire about how they estimate. Inquire about how they get information, right? So you're observing people doing controls. You're asking management and people performing controls. Why are you doing this? What do you do? Where is this? Right? So you can review policy. So the policy is the control, right? It's our policy that when we estimate something, this is the procedure we follow. So you get the copy of the policy, see if they're following that procedure. Excuse me. For long-term debt, are there minutes? Can you inquire about this of people who are in charge of it? So mostly you're getting minutes, you're reviewing them, right? These are all high dollar transactions. You're reading things. You're reading the audit committee for oversight. You're looking at documents. So basically the controls are authorizing by typically the board, right? Custody, so controls for custody would be for certain kinds of investments. They're locked up in a lockbox. They They only stay at the broker's office, things like that. Who has custody of these investments? So you're looking into that. The accounting, who's responsible for the accounting, and how do they decide on the accounting, right? So the accounting, a lot of this is estimates and things. So how do they decide that? Those are the controls. Authorizing, custody, and recording. And then there's some reconciliation. Somebody's going back and looking it over. Audit committee looking it over. Internal audit looking things over. So what are they doing? Are they reconciling? Now, this cycle has a lot of estimates. We do depreciation. Financial instruments may need an estimate of their fair market value. Losses, goodwill impairment, right? I mean, these are estimates. This is like the number is what somebody says it is. All right, so there need to be controls in place that you can look at to make yourself happy that they're not just making up numbers and the numbers aren't like what they want them to be, right? So who prepares it? Is it somebody? So this is the control. The person who prepares it should be somebody who knows what they're doing, right? An accountant who specializes in depreciation, somebody who's estimating things, right? So who's doing it? When are they prepared? Is a depreciation schedule established up front and modified if needs be? Or do they wait till the end of the period and see how much depreciation expense they need, right? Do they say, oh, we're not going to make our numbers, we need little expense, right? So let's say the residual value is very high. Let's estimate that very high. So we estimate the residual value at this up front, and we get this whole schedule, and we're taking it according to schedule. Where do they get the data for that? If they're estimating fair market value for something, it's a financial instrument, and you see they're using, I don't know, a discounted cash flow. Well, why are you using a discounted cash flow? There's clearly a market for this. The market value of it, right? So what data did they come up with? Who reviews and approves it, right? So is there some mechanism that makes sure those numbers are good? And have prior estimates been compared with subsequent events? So you might be coming into a situation where they've taken this much depreciation on something and they'd estimated this residual value, and then when they sold that thing, the residual value was nothing like what they estimated it to be, right? So now perhaps they even have a gain on that investment when it should have been being depreciated more, right? Or less, right? Like that. So that's what you need to be thinking about when you're looking at internal controls. When we come back, we'll talk about substantive procedures.